Over the last few decades, there had actually been several murders that took place on the Appalachian Trail. And in fact, one of those killings took place less than 2 miles away from where Ricky was fishing with his dog. And in that double homicide, a very well-known killer named Randall Lee Smith had stabbed and shot to death 2 hikers. And so while Ricky was really looking for help from fellow hikers, at the same time, he couldn't help but feel somewhat apprehensive. Because again, Ricky was like this small, frail guy, and Ricky was well aware of these murders, and he was well aware of the fact that he was super close to one of the murder sites. And so Ricky was totally on edge as he's listening to this male voice get closer and closer, and then finally, this man in his early 30s steps out from the tree line, and he looks over and he sees Ricky, and for a second, the 2 men just kind of look at each other, but then this guy just grinned at Ricky and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And immediately, Ricky felt relieved, because he could tell just from looking at this guy that very likely he was not a threat. The man introduced himself as Scott Johnston, and he told Ricky he was actually camping in the area with a friend of his, and they were out here fishing, just like Ricky. And Ricky pretty much immediately said, "Oh, great, nice to meet you. Do you have any food for me?" And Scott was like, "Absolutely." And he dug into his bag that he had with him, and he pulled out a couple energy bars and a bag of chips, and he threw them over to Ricky. And he also gave some fresh bait to Ricky, so he too could cast out again. And for the next couple of hours, Scott and Ricky just stood on the riverbank and fished together. And after a while, the trout did start biting, and they did start catching fish, so the day kind of turned into a great outing for Ricky. And it got even better, because as soon as the men were done fishing, Scott asked Ricky if he wanted to join him and his friend back up at the campsite for dinner. And remember, Ricky had no food, so this was an amazing invitation. And he said, "Yes, of course, I'd love to join you." So the 2 men packed up their stuff right as the sun was going down, and then they began walking back into the forest where Scott had emerged from. And as they were walking, Scott's fishing pole got tangled on a low-hanging branch, and he was really struggling to get it out of the tree. And so finally, he just told Ricky to, go on ahead, my campsite's right up there, it's a straight shot, just go up the hill, and you'll see it. Ricky asked Scott if he was sure, and Scott said, "No, it's totally fine, go ahead." So Ricky said, "Okay," and he walked the rest of the way up the hill, and then when he walked out of the tree line into the clearing where Scott's campsite was, immediately what Ricky noticed was this enormous man who was like twice the size of Scott, and so 4 times the size of Ricky, kind of hunched over the campfire. And this huge man, who presumably was Scott's friend, he heard Ricky walk into the circle, and remember, it's nighttime, and they're kind of in the middle of nowhere, and so this guy, he turns his head around and sees this strange man just standing there, and Scott's nowhere to be found, and so this guy, he grabs a club, like a piece of wood, and he looks at Ricky kind of menacingly, like, "What are you doing here?" And Ricky, who was so caught off guard by just how big this guy was, he put his hands up and he said, "I'm so sorry, Scott sent me up here, I don't know if this is the right site, I'm sorry." But just at that moment, Scott had finished untangling his fishing line, and he came out of the tree line, and he patted Ricky on the back, and he said, "Oh, you've already met my friend Sean." And as soon as he said that, Sean looked like he basically let his guard down. He put the wood down,